The mud of Milne Bay is not merely wet earth, it is a biological entity, a living, breathing organism that swallows men whole. It is August 1942, on the eastern tip of New Guinea, and the world is dissolving into a grey, malaria-ridden slush. If you stand still for too long here, the jungle begins to digest you. The humidity sits at a suffocating 95%, a wet blanket that presses against the lungs, turning every breath into a conscious effort. It rains 300 inches a year here, 25 feet of water falling from a sky that seems permanently bruised. In this rotting cathedral of vines and disease, a collision is about to happen that defies every tactical textbook written in Tokyo or Canberra. On one side, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, the Marines of the Emperor, undefeated, terrifying, flushed with the arrogance of 6 months of uninterrupted conquest. They are the apex predators of the Pacific, convinced that the white man's will to fight has been broken at Singapore, broken in the Philippines, broken in Malaya. They look at the map of Milne Bay and see a stepping stone, a trivial obstacle, a muddy doormat on the way to Port Moresby, and then inevitably Australia itself. They call their plan impossible to stop because they do not believe the enemy exists in any meaningful form. To them, the defenders are ghosts, phantoms of a crumbling empire. On the other side, waiting in the slop, are the Australians. But these are not the hardened veterans of Tobruk or the desert rats of El Alamein, not yet. Many of these men are chocos, chocolate soldiers, derisive slang for militia conscripts who were supposed to melt in the heat of battle. They are boys from Queensland farms and Sydney suburbs, armed with equipment that dates back to the First World War, wearing uniforms that turn into fungal breeding grounds within hours. There are 1,365 of them on the front line of the initial assault, backed by a mix of AIF veterans who look at their younger counterparts with a mixture of pity and dread. They are digging holes in liquid earth, their boots rotting off their feet, waiting for an enemy they have been told is invincible. The intelligence reports are terrifying. The Japanese move through the jungle like spirits. They don't take prisoners, they eat the flesh of the dead. Fear is the primary currency here. It smells like cordite and unwashed bodies. But what the Japanese do not know, what their arrogant commanders in Rabaul have failed to calculate, is that desperation has a unique chemical property. When you back a rat into a corner, even a chocolate rat, it doesn't melt. It bites. And it bites with a ferocity that can tear the throat out of a giant. This is the story of how a suicidal defense, a plan built on mud and stubbornness, turned the tide of the Pacific War not with grand strategy, but with the bayonet, the grenade, and the refusal to take one step back. To understand why 4,000 elite Japanese troops were about to walk into a meat grinder, we have to look at the map through the eyes of Commander Mitsuharu Mikawa. The Japanese strategy is simple: speed and shock. They need an airfield at the tip of New Guinea to dominate the Coral Sea. Milne Bay is a perfect natural harbour, a deep gash in the coastline, 7 miles wide and 20 miles long, surrounded by mountains that trap the clouds and the rain. It is a strategic prize. Allied intelligence, specifically the signals intercepts from Magic, knows they are coming. But knowing the enemy is coming and stopping them are two different things. The Australian commander, Major General Cyril Claus, is a man under siege not just by the enemy, but by his own superiors. In Melbourne, General MacArthur and General Blamey are screaming for aggression, demanding he hold the ground. Claus is a methodical, cautious man, a veteran of Gallipoli and France. He looks at Milne Bay and sees a trap. The bay is too wide to defend everywhere. The jungle is too dense to see anything. If he spreads his men too thin, the Japanese will punch through like a needle through wet paper. If he concentrates them, he risks being flanked. It is a tactical nightmare. He decides on a plan that seems suicidal to the armchair generals. He will largely concede the beaches. He will let the Japanese land. He will let them walk into the swamp. And then he will kill them in the dark. The Japanese invasion force, known as the RE operation, leaves Rabaul on August 24th. They are in high spirits. Why shouldn't they be? They are the conquerors of Asia. The men of the 5th Kure Special Naval Landing Force are tough, disciplined, and brutal. They carry the Type 38 Arisaka rifle, the knee mortar, and the heavy Type 92 machine gun. They have light tanks, Type 95 Hago tanks, that can traverse mud that would stop a truck. They expect to brush aside the Australian resistance in a matter of days. Their intelligence tells them there are perhaps a few hundred men at Milne Bay, poorly equipped and ravaged by disease. They are bringing 2,400 men in the first wave alone, with another 1,200 to follow. The math in their minds is absolute. 4,000 elites versus a handful of sick conscripts. It isn't a battle plan, it's a liquidation schedule. But the friction of war begins before the first boot hits the sand. As the Japanese convoy steams south, Allied air power intervenes. RAF Kittyhawks flying from the very airstrips the Japanese want to capture spot the barges. They dive. The slaughter on the water is the first sign that this will not be a parade. Barges explode. Men drown in their heavy gear. Supplies, critical food and ammunition, sink to the bottom of the Solomon Sea. The Japanese Commander Shojiro Hayashi, is forced to land his troops miles east of the intended landing zone. Instead of landing near the airfield, they are dumped onto a narrow strip of coast near Ahioma, separated from their objective by 7 miles of the worst terrain on Earth. It is a jungle corridor of death, squeezed between razor-backed mountains and the shark-infested bay. And waiting in that corridor are the Australians. Among the defenders is Private Jack Bluey Thompson, a composite of several militia diarists, a 19-year-old from Brisbane. He has never fired a shot in anger. He sits in a waterlogged pit near KB Mission, a small clearing in the jungle that is about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from the onset of malaria chills. He clutches a Lee Enfield rifle that feels heavy and greasy in the humidity. Next to him is Corporal Bill Mac Mackenzie, a veteran who fought in the Middle East. Mac is cleaning his fingernails with a bayonet, a picture of calm that Bluey finds terrifying. "They're just blokes, Bluey," Mac says, his voice low. "They bleed like us, just aim for the gut. The chest is too hard to hit in the dark. Aim for the belt buckle." Bluey nods, but he doesn't believe it. He has heard the stories of the Japanese screaming banzai as they charge, of them feigning surrender to pull a grenade pin. The jungle around them is noisy, insects buzzing like chainsaws, birds screaming, but underneath it, there is a silence. The silence of thousands of men holding their breath. The night of August 25th brings the enemy. It is a pitch-black night, rain pouring in sheets so thick you could drown looking up. The Japanese landing barges crunch onto the gravel at Wagga Wagga. They pour out, organizing quickly despite the chaos of the air attacks. They have their tanks. 2 of them land successfully. The sound of their engines revving is a new horror for the militia boys. Tanks in the jungle. It was supposed to be impossible. The trees are too thick. The mud is too deep. But the Japanese have brought flamethrowers and headlights. They begin to advance west along the coastal track, pushing towards the airfields. The first contact is not a grand battle. It is a confused, bloody stumble in the dark. An Australian patrol boat, the Bronzewing, stumbles into the Japanese fleet and is blown out of the water. On land, the forward pickets of the 61st Militia Battalion see movement. Shadows detaching themselves from shadows. "Halt! Who goes there?" a sentry screams. The answer is a burst of frantic Japanese shouting and the chatter of a Nambu machine gun. The tracers rip through the wet leaves like angry fireflies. The battle for Milne Bay has begun. It is messy. It is intimate. At ranges of less than 10 yards, men are shooting at muzzle flashes. The Japanese tactics are immediately apparent. Aggression. They don't seek cover, they seek contact. They push forward, probing the Australian lines, looking for a weak spot. And they find the militia. The 61st Battalion is stretched thin. They fall back, fighting a delaying action. To the Japanese, this retreat confirms their bias. The enemy is running. They press harder. Commander Hayashi orders his tanks forward. The Type 95s clank along the muddy track, their headlights cutting through the rain, blinding the defenders. Private Thompson sees the lights first. "Tank!" The scream goes down the line. Panic, cold and sharp, spikes in his chest. They have no anti-tank guns here. Only boys' anti-tank rifles. heavy, useless pieces of pipe that fire a 55 caliber round that usually bounces off Japanese armor like pebbles. Thompson watches as a tank rumbles into view, its machine guns spraying the undergrowth. A man near him, a kid named Evans, stands up to throw a grenade and is cut in half. The sound is wet and final. Thompson fires his rifle, working the bolt, aiming for the slits in the tank's armor, knowing it's futile. The monster rolls on. The Australians break. They run back through the mud, slipping, falling, abandoning kit. It looks like a rout. In Rabaul, the radio messages are triumphant. Enemy fleeing, airfield capture imminent. But General Close is not panicking. He is watching the map. He sees the Japanese pushing into the funnel. The further west they come, the narrower the track gets, the deeper the mud becomes. He is trading space for time. He knows that the Japanese supply lines are stretching. He knows that every mile they march in that rain is a mile that saps their strength. He orders the 210th Battalion, tough AIF veterans, to move up and stiffen the line. He brings up his artillery, 25-pounder guns that can drop high explosives with pinpoint accuracy. He is setting the table for a slaughter. The Suicidal plan relies on the Japanese belief that the Australians will keep running. Clowes is betting everything on the moment when his men stop running and start digging. The conditions for the Japanese are deteriorating rapidly. They have no tents. They have little food. The rain dissolves their rice rations into paste. Their uniforms are soaked through, and they are walking into a disease trap. Milne Bay is one of the most malarial spots on Earth. The Anopheles mosquito doesn't care about the emperor. It bites Japanese skin just as easily as Australian. Within 24 hours, men are shivering with fevers of 104 degrees. But their discipline drives them on. They attack again the next night, and the night after that. Always at night. The Japanese hate the day, because the day belongs to the RAF Kitty Hawks. The P-40 pilots, flying from the muddy strip at Guinea Field just a few miles away, are the angels of death. They fly so low, their propellers clip the palm fronds. They strafe the Japanese columns with 650 caliber machine guns. The sound is a continuous ripping roar. Japanese bodies are blown apart, shredded, turned into unrecognizable meat on the track. The tanks are hunted down and disabled. But when the sun sets, the planes land, and the demons of the jungle come out again. By August 27th, the Japanese have reached the edge of the KB mission. This is the first major defensive line. The Australians have stopped running. The 61st Militia, battered and bloodied, has linked up with the 25th Brigade. They are dug in among the coconut palms. The mud in the foxholes is thigh-deep. Men are sleeping standing up, leaning against the clay walls of their pits. Trench foot is rampant, skin turning white, then grey, then black, sloughing off in chunks. Private Thompson looks at his feet and sees raw flesh. He wraps them in dirty rags. He hasn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. He is hallucinating from fatigue. He sees shapes in the trees that aren't there. But when the sun goes down on the 27th, the shapes become real. The Japanese launch a massive banzai charge. It starts with a bugle call, an eerie, terrifying sound that cuts through the rain. Then the chanting, "Utsutsu, utsutsu," strike, strike. And then they come, a wave of humanity surging out of the darkness. They are not using tactics now. They are using weight of numbers. They run straight into the crossfire of the Australian Vickers machine guns. The sound of the battle is a solid wall of noise, grenades exploding, men screaming, the thump, thump, thump of the heavy guns. Thompson fires until his rifle barrel is too hot to touch. He sees faces in the muzzle flashes, teeth bared, eyes wide with fanaticism. He shoots a man 5 feet away. The Japanese soldier falls forward, landing on the parapet of the foxhole, his blood draining into the mud at Thompson's feet. Thompson pushes the body off and keeps firing. The chocolate soldiers are not melting. They are hardening into iron. The attack fails. The Japanese recede into the jungle, leaving piles of dead behind. The stench of death begins to compete with the smell of the swamp. In the morning light, the carnage is revealed. Bodies are stacked like cordwood in front of the machine gun posts. The mud is red. But the Japanese are not done. They have landed reinforcements. Commander Hayashi is furious. He cannot believe he is being held by a rabble. He gathers his officers. They will try a flank attack. They will move through the deep swamp to the north, bypassing the coastal track, and strike the airfield directly. It is a bold move. It is a suicidal move in its own right, for the swamp is impassable. But they are the Emperor's Marines. They do the impossible. They step off the track and disappear into the green hell, dragging their heavy weapons, dragging their wounded, driven by a pride that is about to lead them into a catastrophe. Meanwhile, behind the lines, the psychological toll on the Australians is mounting. The constant rain, the lack of sleep, the fear of the dark, it breaks men. Some go troppo, staring blankly at the wall, unable to speak. Others weep uncontrollably. General Close knows his line is bending. He needs to counterattack. But timing is everything. If he attacks too soon, he hits the fresh Japanese reinforcements. If he attacks too late, the airfield falls. He is playing a game of poker with human lives. He orders the 212th Battalion to prepare. These are fresh troops. They are angry. They have heard what the Japanese did to the captured militiamen, found tied to trees, bayoneted, mutilated. The rage is cold and focused. They are not fighting for territory anymore. They are fighting for revenge. The stage is set for the turning point. The Japanese believe they are pushing a crumbling enemy. The Australians know they are luring a blind giant into a pit. The mud is about to claim its due. As the rain intensifies, turning the battlefield into a slurry that sucks boots off feet and drowns the wounded where they fall, the two armies prepare for the final collision. The impossible plan is about to be tested against the reality of the bayonet. And in the darkness of the Milne Bay jungle, the myth of Japanese invincibility is waiting to die. The darkness at Milne Bay on August 31st, 1942, is not merely the absence of light. It is an oppressive physical entity. The rain has stopped momentarily, leaving behind a dripping silence that is more unnerving than thunder. The battlefield, now centered on No. 3 airstrip, is a sea of liquefied mud, craters filled with stagnant water, and coconut tree stumps shattered by artillery. The smell is a nauseating mix of rotting vegetation, sour cordite, and the sickly sweet stench of decomposing bodies that have bloated in the tropical heat. For the Australian defenders entrenched at the edge of the strip, an exhausted mix of the 25th and 61st Battalions, now reinforced by the veterans of the 212th, this is the line in the sand. Or rather, the line in the slime. Behind them are the Kitty Hawks, the only things keeping Japan from dominating the skies. In front of them, invisible in the black mass of the jungle at the eastern end of the strip, are the Imperial Marines. They are gathering. The Australians can hear them, the sound of metal clinking on metal, guttural whispers, the click of bolts being pulled. The enemy is not hiding. They are preparing for the final blow. Commander Hayashi, frustrated by the stubborn resistance of what he considers inferior rabble, has decided to abandon subtlety. He is going to throw everything he has into a frontal charge across the open space of the airstrip. It is an all-or-nothing gamble. He believes the Japanese warrior spirit, the Yamato Damashi, will be enough to overcome the Australian Vickers machine guns. He is about to make the bloodiest mistake of his career. At 03 Jammer AM, hell opens its gates. It starts not with artillery, but with human noise. A collective roar rises from the jungle edge, a primal scream of 1,000 voices shouting in unison. Then, the flares go up, bathing the airstrip in a ghostly, wavering green light. And they come, hundreds of them. Running out of the trees, fixed bayonets gleaming under the flares, officers brandishing samurai swords above their heads. They do not run for cover, they run to die. It is the banzai charge. For the young Australian conscripts, the Chocos, seeing this human wave rushing towards them, should be the breaking point. It should be the moment they drop their rifles and run. But something has changed in the last 5 days of hell. The fear has burned away, leaving behind only a cold mechanical rage. Sergeant Bluey Thompson, now a veteran of a week that feels like a decade, adjusts the feed on his Bren gun. He doesn't see monsters. He sees targets. "Wait for it," whispers a veteran sergeant next to him. "Wait until you see the whites of their eyes or their gold teeth." The fire discipline is absolute. The Japanese wave hits the 100-yard mark. 50 yards, 30. Fire! The Australian line explodes. 12 Vickers machine guns and dozens of Brens open up simultaneously. The sound is like a giant canvas being ripped in half. The front of the Japanese charge simply evaporates. Men are cut in half by the torrent of 303 caliber lead. They fall in piles, stumbling over each other, but the ones behind keep coming, jumping over the bodies of their comrades, screaming, firing from the hip. It is a mechanized slaughter. No. 3 strip becomes a killing floor. Tracers ricochet off the hard coral of the runway, creating a web of lethal light at knee height. A Japanese officer, screaming commands, manages to get within 10 yards of the Australian line before being literally lifted off the ground by the impact of a Mills grenade. He falls, his sword flying into the mud. The charge lasts minutes, but it feels like hours. The Japanese momentum breaks against the wall of fire. They retreat, leaving behind a carpet of dead and wounded groaning in the darkness. The silence returns, punctuated only by the cries of the dying calling for their mothers or the Emperor. In Thompson's hole, the barrel of his Bren is glowing a dull red. He shakes, the adrenaline leaving his system, replaced by a violent nausea. He vomits bile into the mud. They held. The chocos didn't melt, but dawn brings a new reality, more horrific than the night battle. As the sun rises over the misty mountains, the extent of the carnage on the airstrip is revealed. Japanese bodies are stacked in grotesque mounds, some frozen in running poses, others blown apart by artillery. The smell is instant and overpowering. The tropical heat begins to cook the dead immediately. And then, the snipers start. The Japanese, though defeated in the main charge, have left behind suicide men tied to the tops of coconut trees, camouflaged with fronds, with orders to kill officers and medics. The sound of a single dry crack becomes the sound of the day. A man goes to fetch water and falls with a hole in his forehead. A stretcher-bearer tries to help a wounded man and is shot in the neck. Paranoia sets in. Every tree is suspect. The Australians begin to spray the treetops with machine gun fire, raining down coconuts, leaves, and occasionally a limp body that falls with a dull thud to the ground. It is at this point, on September 1st, that the psychological tide of the battle turns irrevocably. General Clowes, sensing that the enemy has spent their life force in the futile charge, decides it is time to stop defending and start hunting. He orders the counterattack, but it is not a glorious cavalry charge. It is a slow, methodical, excruciating advance through the mud. The mud is the true enemy now. It reaches the knees, sometimes the waist. It sucks boots off men's feet. It gets into rifle breeches, jamming weapons. It turns every step into a weightlifting exercise. The Australian advance towards KB Mission and beyond, towards the original Japanese landing site, becomes a battle of attrition. They advance 200 yards, find a Japanese machine gun nest, flank it, destroy it with grenades, and advance another 200 yards. The brutality of combat reaches new levels. The Australians begin to find evidence of Japanese atrocities. In a clearing, a patrol from the 212th Battalion finds the bodies of 2 missionaries and a group of Australian soldiers captured days earlier. They have been tied to trees with barbed wire. Their bodies show signs of prolonged torture, bayoneted repeatedly, mutilated. The sight hardens the Australians' hearts like stone. The gentleman's rules of war, if they ever existed, vanish completely. There are no more calls for surrender. When they find a wounded Japanese soldier, the reaction is no longer pity. It is a mercy shot or a bayonet driven by vengeful fury. "They aren't human," mutters a corporal staring at the tortured bodies. "They are rabid animals, and you put down rabid animals." This dehumanization is mutual. The Japanese, starving, sick, and now retreating, see the Australians as white demons who refuse to die. Japanese logistics collapse completely. With no food, no medicine, cut off from their supplies by Allied aircraft bombing their barges, the Emperor's elite soldiers begin to starve. They resort to eating roots, sludge, and, according to whispered, horrifying reports, the flesh of their own dead. The iron discipline begins to crack. Commander Hayashi, realizing his force is being decimated not just by bullets but by exhaustion and disease, orders a retreat to the original base at Wagga Wagga. But retreating in the Milne Bay jungle is just as deadly as attacking. The wounded cannot be carried. They are left behind with a grenade and an order. Die with honor. Take an enemy with you. The Japanese retreat path becomes a trail of tears and blood, marked by bloated corpses that serve as a feast for land crabs and wild pigs. As the Australians push east, retaking the KB mission, they encounter desperate resistance from the Japanese rearguard. These men, left to die to buy time, fight with the ferocity of cornered rats. In a typical skirmish, Platoon 4 of the 2nd Battalion comes across a camouflaged bunker. Corporal John French, a quiet man from rural Queensland, watches his section get pinned down by 3 machine gun nests. Men fall around him. French knows if they stay there, they all die. Without a word, he orders his men to take cover. He pulls out grenades. Alone, he runs towards the first bunker. Bullets kick up geysers of mud around his feet. He throws the grenade. Boom. Silence in the first nest. He doesn't stop. He runs to the second, firing his Thompson submachine gun from the hip. He silences it. But he is wounded now, bleeding. The third bunker still spits fire. French, stumbling, gathers his last strength and launches himself against the third position. The final explosion silences the enemy guns forever. When his men move up, they find French dead, draped over the body of a Japanese gunner. He had cleared the path alone. His posthumous Victoria Cross would be a testament to the courage born in that mud hell. But individual heroism is only part of the equation. The Australians' true secret weapon remains the Kitty Hawks of No. 75 and 76 squadrons. With the weather clearing slightly, the pilots fly almost suicidal close support missions. They fly so low that the empty casings from their cannons fall onto the heads of their own troops. For the Japanese, the sound of that Allison V-12 engine screaming in a dive is the sound of the apocalypse. There is nowhere to hide. The 50 caliber rounds turn the jungle into sawdust and flesh into red mist. One pilot, squadron leader Bluey Truscott, becomes a legend. He lands, refuels, takes off, kills, repeats. His aircraft is full of rifle bullet holes fired from the ground, but he keeps flying. The air support breaks the backbone of Japanese logistics. They cannot move a boat, a truck, or even a large group of men during the day without being torn apart. By September 4th, the situation for the Japanese has gone from desperate to catastrophic. Commander Hayashi sends a radio message to Rabaul. The arrogance is gone. The tone is pleading. The situation is critical. Our losses are heavy. I request permission to evacuate. Rabaul's response is delayed. High Command cannot process the defeat. How can 4,000 samurai lose to militiamen? They hesitate, and in that hesitation, hundreds more men die in the mud. Finally, the order comes: evacuate. But there are no transport ships. The Imperial Navy will have to send cruisers and destroyers at night to rescue the survivors. Until then, they must hold the beach at Wagga Wagga. The final Australian march to crush the Japanese beachhead is a descent into the heart of darkness. The rain restarts with full force, turning the battlefield into a lake. Men have been living in water for 10 days. Their uniforms are rotting, tearing at the slightest touch. Their skin is covered in ringworm and tropical ulcers. Dysentery is so common that men cut out the backs of their trousers so they don't have to constantly pull them down. They march like zombies, driven only by hatred and inertia. Kill or be killed is no longer a cliché. It is the only remaining brain function. They reach the outskirts of Wagga Wagga and find the Japanese field hospital. The scene awaiting them defies description. The smell hits them from 200 yards away. Hundreds of wounded and sick have been left there. Without medicine, wounds have turned gangrenous. Maggots infest the living. Some Japanese, unable to move, try to detonate grenades against their own chests when they see the Australians. Others beg for water. But there is no water. There is only mud and blood. The Australian soldiers, hardened by everything they have seen, move through the hospital like grim, exterminating angels. There is no pleasure in the killing now, just a sanitary necessity. It is the end of humanity at Milne Bay. War has reduced everything to basic biology: survive and eliminate the competition. On the night of September 5th, the Japanese rescue ships appear on the horizon, black silhouettes against the grey sea. The cruiser, Tenryu, and 2 destroyers. They begin to shell the coast to cover the retreat, their 5-inch guns ripping up the jungle. The Australians take cover in their water-filled craters, hugging the shaking earth. Under the cover of the explosions, the remnants of the Special Naval Landing Force, once the proud elite, drag themselves to the beach. They do not march, they crawl. Healthy men carry the wounded, but many are left behind in the surf, too weak to climb onto the barges, drowning yards from salvation. The loading is chaotic. Boats capsize, men scream, and from the jungle edge, Australian machine guns continue to fire, sending tracers into the darkness, seeking flesh until the last second. When the sun rises on September 6th, the ships are gone. The silence that descends on Milne Bay is absolute, heavy, and terrible. The battle is over. But the landscape is an open-air graveyard. Japanese bodies float in the surf, bumping gently against the black sand. Destroyed tanks, now rusting rapidly in the salt spray, sit like monuments of dead steel. Equipment, flags, swords, unsent letters. The detritus of a defeated army covers the beach for miles. General Close receives the report. Organized resistance has ceased. They won. The suicidal plan worked, but there is no celebration. There are no cheers. The men of the 25th, the 61st, the 2 to 12th just sit in the mud. They light wet cigarettes with shaking hands. They look into each other's faces, faces aged 20 years in 2 weeks, and try to comprehend that they are still alive. They proved the impossible. They stopped Japan. But the cost is etched in their hollow eyes, the 1,000-yard stare that is now the trademark of every man who survived the meat grinder of Milne Bay. And the cleanup. The cleaning of bodies, the counting of lost friends, the writing of letters to mothers, and that is only just beginning. The departure of the Japanese cruisers on the morning of September 6th does not bring peace to Milne Bay. It brings a different kind of war. A quieter, nastier, more intimate war. The major assaults are over. The banzai charges have ceased. The artillery duels have faded into ringing tinnitus in the ears of the defenders. But the jungle is not empty. Left behind in the chaotic evacuation are hundreds of Japanese soldiers. Some were too wounded to move to the beach. Some were lost in the labyrinth of swamps. Some were simply abandoned by officers who prioritized saving the regimental colors over saving their men. These stragglers are now trapped in a hostile biological cage, cut off from food, medicine, and hope. They are the living ghosts of the Emperor's army. And the Australians, fueled by a week of witnessing atrocities and the death of their mates, are not in a mood to take prisoners. The order comes down from General Close, unwritten but understood in every platoon. Clear the area. It is a euphemism for extermination. The Battle of Milne Bay transforms from a clash of armies into a manhunt. For Corporal Mac Mackenzie and the survivors of the 212th Battalion, the victory feels like a hallucination. They are standing in the wreckage of the Japanese beachhead at Wagga Wagga, surrounded by the detritus of a collapsed invasion force. The beach is a junkyard of imperial ambition. There are crates of soggy rice, piles of rusted bicycles that were never ridden, maps of Australia that will never be used, and bodies, everywhere bodies. The smell is thick enough to taste, a cloying, greasy sweetness that sticks to the back of the throat and ruins the appetite forever. But they cannot stop to retch. They have to push east. They have to sweep the jungle. The mopping up is not a police action. It is a series of lethal hide-and-seek games played in visibility of less than 10 feet. Every clump of ferns, every hollow log, every bomb crater could hide a desperate man with a grenade. The Australians move in extended lines, their boots squelching in the eternal mud. They carry Owen guns, the ugly, reliable Australian submachine guns that work even when dipped in sludge. They are jumpy. The adrenaline of the main battle has crashed, leaving them jittery and exhausted. When a wild pig bursts from the undergrowth, 5 men open fire before realized it's not a soldier, but often it is a soldier. The encounters are brief and brutal, a rustle in the leaves, a shape rising from the mud like a golem, a burst of fire. Silence. There are no speeches. There are no surrenders. The Japanese stragglers are in a state of terminal psychosis induced by starvation and shame. They believe that capture means torture and dishonor, so they fight with the strength of the dying. In one sector, a patrol finds a Japanese soldier sitting against a tree, his leg blown off at the knee, maggots swarming the stump. He is holding a photo of his family. When the Australians approach offering water, he tries to pull the pin on a grenade pressed against his chest. A burst from an Owen gun ends his misery before the pin comes out. The Australians look at the photo, fluttering into the mud, a woman in a kimono, two small children, and feel a confusing mixture of pity and revulsion. This confusion hardens them. To survive this, you have to turn off the empathy switch. You have to stop seeing fathers and husbands and start seeing only threats. The dehumanization is complete. The enemy becomes vermin to be flushed out. As the Australians push deeper into the abandoned Japanese positions, the true scale of the horror reveals itself. They find the Japanese field kitchens. The pots are empty or filled with boiled grass and roots. But near the perimeter, they find evidence that turns the stomachs of even the hardest veterans. Bodies of Allied soldiers and local Papuans sliced open, flesh removed from thighs and buttocks. The rumors of cannibalism, whispered in the rear echelons, are confirmed in the rotting gloom of the jungle. The Japanese, starving and abandoned by their logistics chain, had broken the ultimate taboo. For the young Australian militia boys, seeing this shatters their last illusions about the nobility of war. They are not fighting soldiers, they are fighting something that has devolved beyond civilization. This discovery spreads through the ranks like wildfire. It confirms the narrative: kill them all. The environment itself seems to be conspiring to erase the Japanese. The rain continues to fall, washing away the blood, but not the sins. The rivers swell, carrying bloated corpses down to the bay where the sharks wait. The jungle reclaims the dead with terrifying speed. Vines grow over abandoned tanks. Fungus blooms on leather boots. The Japanese stragglers wandering in circles are eaten alive by the ecosystem. Tropical ulcers eat through skin to the bone in days. Malaria shakes them until their hearts give out. Dysentery drains the fluid from their bodies until they are husks. Australians on patrol often find them already dead, curled up in fetal positions, clutching their rifles, killed not by a bullet but by New Guinea itself. Yet amidst this grim cleanup, the strategic magnitude of what has happened begins to dawn on the commanders. General Clowes sends a signal to MacArthur's headquarters. All organized resistance has been crushed. It is a sentence that changes the course of the Pacific War. For 6 months, since the fall of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese army had been an unstoppable juggernaut. They had swept through Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies and the islands of the Pacific, without suffering a single defeat on land. They were considered invincible supermen, masters of the jungle, destined to rule Asia. The psychological weight of this myth had paralyzed Allied commanders. But here in the mud of Milne Bay, a force of Australian militia and AIF regulars, men dismissed as amateurs and chocolate soldiers, had stopped them cold. They had not just stopped them, they had destroyed them. Of the 2,400 elite Marines who landed in the first wave, fewer than 1,300 evacuated. The rest are rotting in the swamp. The news travels to Tokyo, but it travels slowly, filtered through layers of denial and face-saving lies. The Japanese High Command cannot accept the reality. They classify the defeat as a tactical withdrawal. But the soldiers know. The survivors who scrambled onto the destroyers carry the truth back to Rabaul. They tell stories of the green demons, the Australians in their jungle greens, of the relentless artillery, of the mud that swallowed tanks. The aura of invincibility is shattered. The shame is absolute. Commander Hayashi, the man who led the landing with such arrogance, is devastated. In the code of the Imperial Navy, defeat is worse than death. It is a stain on the soul that cannot be washed away. Back at Milne Bay, the mopping up continues for weeks. It becomes a routine of grim efficiency. Private Bluey Thompson, now hollow-eyed and 20 pounds lighter, moves through the jungle like a ghost himself. He has stopped jumping at shadows. He walks with a slouch, his uniform a patchwork of rot and dried mud. He finds a Japanese diary on a dead officer. He can't read the kanji, but he keeps it. It feels like a talisman. He wonders if the man who wrote it knew he was going to die in a place that God forgot. Thompson and his mates are pulled off the line eventually, rotated back to the airfield perimeter to rest, but there is no real rest. They sleep with one eye open. They wake up screaming, reaching for rifles that aren't there. They have survived, but they have left pieces of themselves in the mud that they will never get back. The victory at Milne Bay is not celebrated with parades. It is acknowledged with a grim nod. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, the British commander in Burma, would later write, "Australian troops had at Milne Bay inflicted on the Japanese army its first undoubted defeat on land. Some of us may forget that, of all the Allies, it was Australian soldiers who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army. It is a monumental achievement, bought with blood and suffering. But for the men on the ground, history is an abstract concept. The reality is the smell of the dead. The reality is the grave-digging parties. The reality is the letter-writing. The chaplains move among the men, trying to offer solace, but words ring hollow against the backdrop of the slaughter. How do you explain the necessity of killing a starving man who is too weak to stand? How do you justify the ferocity of the bayonet charge to a god of peace? The men stop asking these questions. They just exist. They smoke cigarettes until their fingers burn. They clean their weapons obsessively. They wait for the next order, because they know this is just the beginning. Milne Bay was the turning point, yes. It proved the Japanese could be beaten, but it also proved what it would cost to beat them. It would cost everything. Every island, every beach, every patch of jungle on the road to Tokyo would have to be bought with this same currency of mud and blood. As September turns to October, the rain finally begins to ease, but the mud remains. The battlefield is slowly sanitized. Bulldozers bury the mass graves. The shattered coconut trees stand as silent sentinels, their trunks riddled with shrapnel. The war moves on. The focus shifts to Guadalcanal, to Kokoda, to Buna. Milne Bay becomes a rear area, a logistics hub. But for the 365 defenders who stood in the rain and faced the Banzai charge, time is frozen. They are the first men to look into the eyes of the dragon and not blink. They have crushed the elite. They have done the impossible. And in doing so, they have condemned themselves to know the terrible secret of victory. That winning a war doesn't feel like glory. It feels like survival. And survival is a heavy burden to carry when so many of your friends are lying under the wet, black earth of New Guinea. When the last shots echo and fade into the humid jungle of Milne Bay, what remains is not the jubilation of victory, but the crushing weight of memory. It is mid-September 1942. The rain, which seemed like a divine punishment during the battle, has subsided to a persistent drizzle, as if the sky is washing the wounds of the earth. But the earth does not forget. Number 3. Airstrip, the stage of the suicidal Banzai charge, is now a silent cemetery. The Australian burial parties move with a reverent, exhausted slowness. They are not just burying bodies, they are burying the innocence of a nation. Young men of 18, 19, who arrived in Papua as scared boys from suburbs and sheep farms, now dig mass graves with the mechanical efficiency of veteran gravediggers. They wrap their friends in mud-soaked blankets. There are no coffins. Wood rots too fast here. There is only the black, volcanic, hungry earth. Every shovel of dirt that falls onto a known face is a sound that will be etched into these men's nightmares until the day they die. The chaplain mutters quick prayers, his words competing with the buzz of blowflies forming black clouds over the open graves. Dust to dust. But here, they do not return to dust. They return to mud. A mud that preserves, that suffocates, that refuses to let go. For the survivors of the 61st Militia Battalion, the despised Chocos, chocolate soldiers, the battle has ended, but the transformation is permanent. The nickname, born of scorn, is now a twisted badge of honor. They didn't melt in the heat of battle. They were forged in it, but the price of that forging is visible in their eyes. It is the 1,000-yard stare, a vacuum where the soul used to be. They sit on empty ammunition crates, smoking cigarettes that tremble in fingers stained with nicotine and cordite, unable to speak about what they saw. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there the sound of a bayonet tearing human flesh? How do you describe the smell of an abandoned Japanese field hospital where the wounded detonated grenades against their own chests? They know they will go back to Australia as heroes, but they feel like ghosts. The official narrative in the newspapers of Sydney and Melbourne screams victory and Japs crushed. But the letters these men write home are short, vague, and devoid of glory. "I'm alive, Mum. Bill didn't make it. It rains a lot here." It is the language of trauma, the retreat into oneself to protect what remains of sanity. Strategically, the victory at Milne Bay is a geopolitical earthquake whose shockwaves are felt from Tokyo to Washington. For the first time in World War II, a Japanese amphibious invasion force has been decisively defeated and forced to retreat. The myth of the Imperial Japanese Army's invincibility, the belief that they were jungle supermen immune to fear and defeat, was broken not by American Marines or British armoured divisions, but by a mixed force of Australian veterans and conscript militia. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, the British commander in Burma, would later write words that would echo in history. Of all the Allies, it was Australian soldiers who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army. Milne Bay saved Port Moresby. If the bay had fallen, Japanese bombers would have had the range to destroy vital shipping lanes and threaten northern Australia with direct invasion. The back door to Australia was locked with a padlock of blood and bone. General MacArthur in his headquarters looks at the map and sees the tide turning. The desperate defence, the suicidal plan to lure the enemy into the swamp and kill them there, has become the template for future battles. Bona Gona Sanananda, the names to come will be equally terrible, but now the Allies know a vital secret. The Japanese soldier can die. He bleeds, he panics, he can be stopped. But for the enemy, the defeat at Milne Bay is a spiritual cancer. In Rabaul, shock gives way to a corrosive shame. Officers who planned the operation commit seppuku, ritual suicide, unable to face the dishonor of losing to an inferior army. The internal Japanese narrative shifts. They do not speak of tactical defeat. They speak of martyrdom. The seed of fanaticism that will bloom on Iwo Jima and Okinawa is watered here. They realize that easy victory is over. The war will now be a war of extermination. The brutality the Australians witnessed, the torture of prisoners, the cannibalism, the perfidy, was not an anomaly. It was a warning. Japan has decided that if it cannot win, it will make the enemy's victory so costly, so horrific, that it will taste like ash. The retreat from Milne Bay was not the end of the horror. It was just the end of the first act. As the months pass and the jungle begins to reclaim the debris of battle, the archaeology of war starts to disappear under the relentless green. The Type 95 Hago tanks, bogged in the mud where they were destroyed, become steel flower pots for wild orchids. Bomb craters fill with water and become ponds for frogs and mosquitoes. But human memory does not heal as fast as nature. Corporal John French, the man who silenced 3 machine gun nests alone and died in the process, receives the Victoria Cross posthumously. His medal goes to a grieving family in Crow's Nest, Queensland. It is a piece of bronze cast from captured cannons, a cold symbol for a warm, vibrant life that was snuffed out in seconds. For every John French, there are hundreds of other names: Thompson, Evans, Mackenzie, men who didn't win medals but left pieces of themselves in that mud. Some left legs, arms, or eyes. Others left their youth, their ability to laugh, their ability to sleep without a light on. Decades later, elderly veterans would return to Milne Bay. They would walk through the palm oil plantations that now cover the old battlefield. They would look for the lines of the trenches, now just gentle depressions in the ground. They would stand in the rain, old men with white hair and shaking hands, and weep, not for the glory of the empire, not for the defense of democracy, but for the friends who never got old, for the face of the boy who stood next to them in the foxhole and whose head exploded in a red mist, for the survivors' guilt that weighed on their shoulders for 50 years. The battle proved that the impossible plan worked, yes, but it also proved that in a modern, industrial total war, there are no intact winners. Victory is merely a state of survival, slightly preferable to defeat. The story of Milne Bay is often overshadowed by the legend of Kokoda, the sister battle happening simultaneously in the mountains above. Kokoda has the romance of the trail, the David versus Goliath fight in the clouds. But Milne Bay was the fight in the gutter. It was the knife fight in the mud. It was where war revealed itself in its nakedest, most repulsive form. It was where the Australians learned that to defeat a monster you must, at least temporarily, become something capable of monstrosities. The fire discipline on the airstrip, the methodical slaughter of Japanese survivors, the hardness required to ignore the screams of the dying, these were the dark lessons of Milne Bay. Today, a modest memorial marks the site. The words engraved in stone speak of courage, sacrifice, and duty. But the true story is not in the stone. It is in the soil. It is in the lead isotopes of the 303 bullets that still poison the earth. It is in the bone fragments that local farmers still find when they plough the fields. And it is in the silence. If you stand on the edge of the old No. 3 strip at twilight, when the jungle birds go quiet and the mist descends from the Owen Stanley Mountains, you can almost hear it. Not the shots, not the explosions, but the breathing. The heavy, terrified, determined breathing of 365 men who stood in the rain, looked into the approaching darkness, and decided they would not take one more step back. They were miners, clerks, farmers, and students. The world called them chocolate soldiers. The enemy called them weak. But in the mud of Milne Bay they wrote their answer in steel and blood, and that answer changed the fate of the world. Japan laughed at their suicidal plan. But in the end, the only thing buried in the mud of that God-forsaken bay was the laughter of the Empire, silenced forever by the thunder of Australian guns.